Hi everyone, just a quick note to say I'm using AI to present the voice of this video because I couldn't record it myself. Don't worry, all the opinions and words are my own. It's just AI delivering them. And this video is more about the data, so presentation ain't super important. So let's jump in.
So I want to start this video by asking it one simple question.
Is the public perception right that RGH3 on Phat consoles is unreliable, kills consoles, and is generally bad? Or is it wrong? Because my opinion is simple. There's nothing wrong with it. But my opinion is not fact. It's a well-known fact that I sell a lot of RGH3 consoles, way more than RGH 1.2. I've done thousands of RGH3 installs, and I've never had a single console die in a way that can be directly linked to RGH3. So instead of just arguing about it online, I thought, let's actually dig deeper and see if we can do some proper testing to get to the bottom of this. What I'm going to do is install RGH3 on 10 Phat consoles, with no resistors and no diodes, and boot each one 3,000 times, and then see what actually happens. Before getting into the test results, let's see what people think about RGH3. I asked this question: what's people's opinion on RGH3 on a Phat? I did this in a couple of Discord servers, and honestly, I was surprised by the responses. There was a very clear divide. Side 1. There were a surprising number of people who said they've been using RGH3 for years with no issues. A lot of them said they use it on their personal consoles, but wouldn't resell it. Another thing I noticed, most of them also said they don't use resistors or diodes. When I checked the chat history of these people, nearly all of them were active in the community. You can tell they're not copy-paste installers. They're not just following a guide. So when they run into issues, they don't get stuck. They're the people you ask for help. Not everyone in this group was like that, but there were more people like this than not. Side 2. Then you have the people saying things like, RGH3 killed my console. It killed more than one of my consoles. It's unreliable. But when you ask follow-up questions, how do you know it was RGH3? What was the error code? Did you try anything else? The answers are usually, I just know it was RGH3. I didn't get the error code. I just left it after that. When you dig deeper, most of these are copy-paste installers. They know how to do it, but not what they're doing. They can follow a guide, but anything outside of that, they're stuck. There's nothing wrong with following a guide, but this is what's wrongfully scaring people away from RGH3. So what I see, very clearly, is people blaming a bad install on RGH3. Even without doing this test, I already know this. If something doesn't work after installing, 95% of the time it's user error. I asked the same question across multiple public servers, so you can easily see the replies for yourself and form your own opinion. And the same thing happened when RGH 1.2 was new. Back in the RGH 1.2 days, it was common to hear, I installed RGH 1.2 and now the console won't turn on. The only difference was it was easier to diagnose back then because you could use the LEDs on the glitch chip. If you're working on a good console with a fixed GPU, 95% of the time it's user error. Most people don't want to admit that, but that's reality. And here's the important part. Nobody involved in the creation or development of RGH3 has ever said it kills consoles. So let's be clear. If you hear RGH3 killed my console, that claim is basically BS. Right now, there is zero properly backed up evidence. Real issues with RGH3, actual facts. Now, RGH3 is far from perfect. The first public release was basically a beta, not a fully polished method. We all know that 15432 was the original creator of RGH3. But what you might not know is he almost gave up making it. It was only when someone gave him files for a method of a glitchless chip dating back to 2010 that he found the motivation to keep going. That 2010 method was essentially just a proof of concept. It did technically work, but it wasn't practical or ready for real-world use. Most early testing was done by a small group of people, including Element, Mana, Josh, and Nitrozidy, usually testing 1 or 2 consoles at a time, with maybe 20 boots per timing file. There were also more timing files early on than we have now, but only 2 made the cut. During that testing, no consoles were killed. But that testing focused on boot reliability, not long-term wear. Nobody was doing thousands of boots back then. One console did have an issue, but that was using a timing file that was not released. This is where the misconceptions really start. You'll see statements like this thrown around a lot. Yes, some of these issues are real, but people misunderstand what they actually mean, blow them out of proportion, and then jump straight to, it kills consoles. The real question should be, does it damage the console in any proven way? And hopefully, the results will show that. Let's start with boot times. There is no large-scale boot time data out there. I've never properly timed it before, but I'd usually say RGH3 is maybe 2 to 3 seconds slower than RGH 1.2. Reliability is where this turns into a rabbit hole. Most of the advice you see online comes from one source, and that source isn't wrong, but it's always compared directly against RGH 1.2. If you stop comparing it to RGH 1.2, it's a completely different story. For example, does RGH3 kill consoles? No. Does it boot reliably? Yes. It boots way more than it doesn't. Out of 10 boots, maybe 2 or 3 fail. Are the boot times slow? Not really. It's an extra 2 to 3 seconds, which is nothing. So what's actually wrong with that? Yes, RGH 1.2 is better, but RGH3 is cheaper. And even if you ignore reselling, it's still cheaper for the end user. You can almost do it for free compared to 1.2. Someone just getting into modding wouldn't need to buy a glitch chip or a programmer, and that can save you like $40 to $50. Instant boot then shutdown issue. One known issue is where the console boots and then immediately shuts down. I don't see this issue much, maybe 1 out of 100 consoles. And that got me thinking, maybe I don't see it because I usually only test boot around 10 times. Maybe that's not enough. So I spoke to Josh, and here's what's actually happening. Post-detection behavior, I called it a bug, but it's not really a bug, it should be called instant off. Quoted from Josh, the Phat CPU only outputs around 1.2 volts on the post bus, while the Southbridge GPIO needs closer to 1.7 volts to reliably detect a logic high. The diode helps, but does not fully fix the issue. This is the only location where stepping the voltage up with a MOSFET would be an acceptable solution. This later gets called a bug in the web UI, but it's not really a bug. It's more an unpolished function. If post isn't detected, the console shuts down. That's it. So if you install RGH3 and the console instantly shuts off every time, the first thing to check is post wiring. But something I find interesting and explained how the CPU post 1.1 volt was able to trigger a 3.3 volt signal. The Southbridge GPIO pin used by RGH3 was originally used for GPU reset, and now it's shared with CPU post. That gives CPU post, which is 1.1 volts, enough drive to push the signal high enough for the Southbridge to see it as a valid logic high, with or without the diode. Originally, that pin allowed the Southbridge to detect whether the GPU was ready, and only then would it continue the boot process. Now, that detection is bypassed, so the Southbridge always assumes the GPU is ready and proceeds. That pin is now repurposed to listen to the CPU's post activity, so it can execute the RGH exploit. Instant off is an issue, but from what I've seen it's very rare, and later in the video we'll see how often it actually happens over long-term testing. Boot times and reliability, the rabbit hole. Again, there's no large-scale boot time data out there. Most early testing was done on 1 or 2 consoles, with maybe 20 boots per timing file. If you judge reliability purely on brand new behavior, RGH 1.2 will always look better, and RGH3 will never be considered reliable. But what are we actually doing this for? To play games. And realistically, RGH3 does what it needs to do. It boots fast, it's consistent, and every now and then it fails, but a quick off/on and you're back in. That's not something I can really complain about. Right now, I can't directly compare RGH3 and RGH 1.2, because this test is RGH3 only. But I do plan to redo this test later and run both methods side by side. RGH3 kills consoles. Reality check. No developer, creator, or contributor has ever said RGH3 kills consoles. Even though talk of the console dying was theoretical, it came from well-informed reasoning. There wasn't data proving it, but it was still a thoughtful, educated guess. That said, it was still wise to keep people cautious about the possibility. So it's not wrong advice. This theoretical concern is what led people to blame their console failures on RGH3. When someone had a bad install and the console died, it was easy to point to the theoretical warnings as the reason, even though it wasn't actually proven. But if there were real issues, we would all be seeing masses of consoles dying now, as it has been in use long enough. Out of the thousands I've installed, not one has been reported to me as dying or booting slower over time. If a console dies after install, 96% of the time it's installer error. And I'll say it clearly, it is not RGH3, not even close. The actual test setup. Here's what I did. I took 10 sealed Phat consoles, 5 Falcons, 5 Jaspers, some were later found to have bad blocks. I connected them each to an ESP32 and set each one to boot 3,000 times, logging everything. The ESP32 was set up to power the console remotely, force shutdown remotely, read debug UART, detect an instant off. I also built a web UI to manage everything. The logic was simple. If 3.3 volts disappears within 3 seconds of power on, arrow log as a bug run, power down, wait 5 seconds, reset. If no boot after 10 seconds, then log as a failed run, wait 5 seconds, reset. If boot is detected, then log success, wait 5 seconds, power down, repeat. And this gives us the data we need. So I want to end this by explaining why I set the test up the way I did, and what this data actually means. All consoles use the same power supply, a 203 watt unit, and I placed the power supply away from the consoles to remove heat and interference as a variable. There were no hard drives and no controllers connected. Each console was also placed in the exact same position every time it was tested. Now, this data is not a final, definitive result. Yes, it tells us whether the console can survive 3,000 boots and whether it dies or not. There are also a possibility that heat or electromagnetic interference could affect it. We will do separate tests for that. Also, until I do the exact same test with RGH 1.2, using the same consoles and the same conditions, how good the booting is can still be debated. So this isn't me saying, this proves everything. It's one controlled dataset. And if you think there's a better way to run this test, or something I should change or add, drop me a message. I'm more than happy to rerun it. Alright, so before I end the video, I just want to properly explain what this data actually shows, because I know some people are going to look at the CSVs and jump to conclusions. First thing to get straight, the web UI and the CSV files are two different things. The web UI is live. That's what's actually counting boots, showing success, fails, retries, the real run. The CSV is just the logger. If the ESP32 crashes or locks up, the console keeps running, but the CSV stops recording. That's why a couple of these runs look incomplete in the CSV, even though if you look at the web UI screenshots, you can clearly see the run finished properly. So missing data does not mean a failed test. It just means the logger fell over. So, the console that shows a high count of failed restarts, what I mistakenly called a boot bug, these are actually false reports. The reason is that the console effectively died, and when the ESP tried to power the console back on, it never actually powered up again, so the system mistakenly registered that as a bug restart. Boot outcomes per console. Looking at the boot outcomes per console, there's one big thing you should notice straight away. Nothing gets worse over time. Failures don't increase. Retries don't ramp up. There's no trend that points to degradation. One console did die during testing, and I want to be clear about this because I fixed it later. That console was NAND related. Once the NAND issue was identified and reflashed, it behaved normally again. So that wasn't RGH3 killing a console, and it wasn't glitch stress. It was a bad NAND. That's an important distinction. Boot streaks per console. Now, boot streaks. This is where the stability really shows. Every console here managed long streaks of clean boots, some of them hundreds in a row. And the important bit is that those streaks don't just happen at the start. They happen all the way through the run. If RGH3 was slowly damaging something, you'd expect those streaks to get shorter over time. They don't. Average boot time per console. Same story with boot times. Each console has its own normal boot time range, which is expected, but that range stays flat. Early boots look like late boots. There's no slow creep, no instability, nothing weird happening as the run goes on. Overall stability. When you step back and look at everything together, boot outcomes, streaks, boot times, and failure distribution, the picture is pretty clear. There's no cumulative damage, no signs of wear, no pattern that points to RGH3 being unsafe or unreliable. The few failures you do see are random and spread out, exactly what you'd expect in a large automated stress test. Data access/transparency. There will be a download link in the description with all of the raw data from this test, the CSV logs, the web UI screenshots, everything. Nothing's filtered, nothing's hidden, nothing's cherry-picked. If you want to go through it yourself, graph it, sanity check it, or try to prove me wrong, you can. That's the whole point of doing it this way. Final takeaway. So the takeaway is simple. The web UI confirms the runs completed. The CSV shows behavior, not hardware death. Missing data is logging failure, not console failure. The one console that died was NAND related, not RGH3. Boot times stay stable. Boot streaks stay long. Failure rates don't increase. Based on this data, there's nothing here that supports the idea that RGH3 kills consoles. This isn't opinion, this is what the data shows. So, that wraps up this test and this video. In the next one, I'll be running the same test on RGH3, RGH3 overclock, and RGH 1.2. We'll compare them side by side to see how fast they perform and how much better RGH 1.2 is over RGH3. Hope you enjoyed this info and hope to see you on the next one.
So I just want to add to a little bit to this video. I'm not trying to say RGH3 is better and you should be using that instead of 1.2. All I'm trying to explain is RGH3 is not as bad as what the small group of people are saying. It is reliable. It's going to be booted within maximum 15 seconds. So it's not unreliable. The performance, on the other hand, it's not as good as 1.2. And again, I don't have the data to back that up, but I think the performance, RGH 1.2 is a much more refined method. In the grand scheme of things, you're just using it to play some games. It's not time critical that you turn it on and every time it boots. An extra couple of seconds is not the end of the world. And regarding the advice about the consoles potentially dying and the resistors and the diodes, I'm not saying that's wrong advice. That advice at the time is completely valid. It was very well educated guesswork and they know a lot, so I'm not disputing that in one bit. But this data kind of proves that, well, it doesn't prove, it's a step forward to showing that it is more reliable and doesn't damage consoles. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'm going to be doing the test comparing 1.2 and 3, and then we can get a bit more conclusive data to see how much better 1.2 is compared to 3.